Degrees he made friends in the neighbourhood, and in 87 he married the daughter of a local brewer, by whom he has now 2 children. He had no occupation, but was interested in several companies, and went into town as a rule in the morning, returning by the 5:14 from Cannon Street every night. Mr. Sinclair is now 37 years of age, a man of temperate habits, a good husband, a very affectionate father, and a man who is popular with all who know him. I may add that his whole debts at the present moment, as far as we have been able to ascertain, amounts to £88 and 10 shillings, while he has £220 standing to his credit in the Capital and Counties Bank. There is no reason, therefore, to think that money troubles have been weighing heavily upon his mind. Last Monday, Mr. Neville Sinclair went into town rather earlier than usual, remarking before he started that he had 2 important commissions to perform, and that he would bring his little boy home a box of bricks. Now, by the merest chance, his wife received a telegram upon this same Monday, very shortly after his departure, to the effect that a small parcel of considerable value, which she had been expecting, was waiting for her at the offices of the Aberdeen Shipping Company. Now, if you're well up in your London, you'll know that the office of the company is in Fresno Street, which branches out of Upper Swandam Lane, where you found me tonight. Mrs. Sinclair had her lunch, started for the city, did some shopping, proceeded to the company's office, got her packet, and found herself at exactly 4:35 walking through Swandam Lane on her way back to the station. Have you followed me so far? It is very clear. If you remember, Monday was an exceedingly hot day, and Mrs. Sinclair walked slowly, glancing about in the hope of seeing a cab, as she did not like the neighbourhood in which she found herself. While she was walking in this way down Swandam Lane, she suddenly heard an ejaculation or cry, and was struck cold to see her husband looking down at her, and it seemed to her beckoning to her from a second-floor window. The window was open, and she distinctly saw his face, which he describes as being terribly agitated. He waved his hands frantically to her, and then vanished from the window so suddenly that it seemed to her that he had been plucked back by some irresistible force from behind. One singular point which struck her quick feminine eye was that although he wore some dark coat, such as he had started to town in, he had on neither collar nor necktie. Convinced that something was amiss with him, she rushed down the steps, for the house was none other than the opium den in which you have found me tonight, and running through the front room she attempted to ascend the stairs which led to the first floor. At the foot of the stairs, however, she met this Lasker scoundrel of whom I have spoken, and who thrust her back in, and, aided by a Dane, who acts as an assistant there, pushed her out into the street. Filled with the most maddening doubts and fears, she rushed down the lane, and by rare good fortune met in Fresno Street a number of constables with an inspector, all on their way to their beat. The inspector and 2 men accompanied her back, and in spite of the continued resistance of the proprietor, they made their way to the room in which Mr. Sinclair had last been seen. There was no sign of him there. In fact, in the whole of the floor there was no one to be found, save a crippled wretch of hideous aspect, whom it seems had made his home there. Both he and the Lasker stoutly swore that no one else had been in the front room during the afternoon. So determined was their denial that the inspector was staggered, and had almost came to believe that Mrs. Sinclair had been deluded when, with a cry, she sprang at a small deal box which lay upon the table and tore the lid from it. Out there fell a cascade of children's bricks. It was the toy which he had promised to bring home. This discovery, and the evident confusion which the cripple showed, made the inspector realize that the matter was serious. The rooms were carefully examined, and results all pointed to an abominable crime. The front room was plainly furnished as a sitting room, and led into a small bedroom, which looked out upon the back of one of the wharves. Between the wharf and the bedroom window is a narrow strip, which is dry at low tide, but is covered at high tide with at least 4.5 feet of water. The bedroom window was a broad one, and opened from below. On examination, traces of blood were to be seen upon the window-sill, and several scattered drops were visible upon the wooden floor of the bedroom. Thrust away behind a curtain in the front room were all the clothes of Mr. Neville Sinclair, with the exception of his coat, his boots, his socks, his hat, and his watch. All were there. There were no signs of violence upon any of these garments, and there were no other traces of Mr. Neville Sinclair. Out of the window he must apparently have gone for no other exit, and could be discovered, and the ominous bloodstains upon the sill gave very little promise that he could save himself by swimming, for the tide was at its very highest at the moment of the tragedy. And now as to the villains who seemed to be immediately implicated in the matter. The Lasker was known to be a man of the vilest antecedents, but as by Mrs. Sinclair's story, he was known to have been at the foot of the stair within a few seconds of her husband's appearance at the window. He could hardly have been more than an accessory to the crime. His defence was one of absolute ignorance, and he protested that he had no knowledge as to the doings of Hugh Boone, his lodger, and that he could not account in any way for the presence of a missing gentleman's clothes. So much for the Lasker manager. Now for the sinister cripple who lives upon the second floor of the opium den, and who was certainly the last human being whose eyes rested upon Neville Sinclair. His name is Hugh Boone, and his hideous face is one which is familiar to every man who goes much to the city. He is a professional beggar, though in order to avoid the police regulations he pretends to be a small trade in wax vesters. Some little distance down Threadneedle Street upon the left-hand side there is, as you may have remarked, a small angle in the wall. Here it is that this creature takes his daily seat, cross-legged with his tiny stock of matches on his lap, and as he is piteous spectacle a small rain of charity descends into the greasy leather cap which lies upon the pavement beside him. I have watched the fellow more than once before ever thought of making his professional acquaintance, and I have been surprised at the harvest which he has reaped in a short time. His appearance, you see, is so remarkable that no one can pass him without observing him. A shock of orange hair, a pale face disfigured by a horrible scar, which by its contraction has turned up the outer edge of his upper lip, a bulldog chin, a pair of very penetrating dark eyes, which present a singular contrast to the colour of his hair, all mark him out from amid the common crowd of his mendicants, and so too does his wit, for he is ever ready with a reply to any piece of chaff which may be thrown at him by the passers-by. This is the man whom we now learn to have been the lodger at the opium den, and to have been the last man to see the gentleman with whom we are in quest. But a cripple, said I. What could he have done single-handed against a man of the prime life? He is a cripple in the sense that he walks with a limp, but in other respects he appears a powerful and well-nurtured man. Surely your medical experience will tell you, Watson, that weakness in one limb is very often compensated for by exceptional strength in the others. Pray continue your narrative. Mrs. Sinclair had fainted at the sight of blood upon the window, and she was escorted home in a cab by the police, as her presence could be of no help to them in their investigations. Inspector Barton, who had charge of the case, made a very careful examination of the premises, but without finding anything which throwed any light upon the matter. One mistake had been made in not arresting Boone instantly, as he was allowed some minutes during which he might have communicated with his friend the Lasker, but this fault was soon be remedied, and he was seized and searched without anything being found which would incriminate him. There were, it is true, some bloodstains upon his right shirt-sleeve, but he pointed to his ring finger, which had been cut near the nail, and explained that the bleeding came from there, adding that he had been knocked to the window not long before, and that the stains which had been observed there came doubtless from the same source. He denied strenuously having ever seen Mr. Neville Sinclair, and swore that the presence of his clothes in the room were as much a mystery to him as to the police. As to Mrs. Sinclair's assertion that she had actually seen her husband at the window, he declared that she must have either been mad or dreaming. He was removed, loudly protesting, to the police station, while the inspector remained upon the premises in the hope that the ebbing tide might afford some fresh clue. And it did, though they hardly found upon the mud bank what they had feared to find. It was Neville Sinclair's coat, and not Neville Sinclair, which lay uncovered as the tide receded. And what do you think they found in the pockets? I cannot imagine. No, I don't think that you would guess. Every pocket was stuffed with pennies and halfpennies, 421 pennies and 270 halfpennies. It is no wonder that it would not have been swept away by the tide. But a human body is a different matter. There is a fierce eddy between the wharf and the house. It seemed likely enough that the weighted coat had remained where the stripped body had been tucked away into the river. But I understand that all the other clothes are found in the room. Would the body be dressed in a coat alone? No, sir, but the facts must be manifestly enough. Suppose this man Boone had thrust Neville Sinclair through the window. There is no human eye which could have seen the deed, What would he do then? It would, of course, instantly strike him that he must get rid of the telltale garments. He would seize the coat then, and be in the act of throwing it out, when it would occur to him that it would swim and not sink. He has little time, for he has heard the scuffle downstairs when the wife tried to force her way up, and perhaps he has already heard from his Lasker confederate that the police are hurrying up the street. There is not an instant to be lost. He rushes to some secret hoard, where he has accumulated the fruits of his beggary, and he stuffs all the coins upon which he can lay his hands into the pockets to make sure that the coat's sinking. He throws it out, and would have done the same with the other garments had he not heard the rush of steps below, and only had just time to close the window when the police appeared. It certainly sounds feasible. Well, we will take it as a working hypothesis for want of a better. Boone, as I have told you, was arrested and taken to the station, but it could not be shown that there had ever been anything against him. He had for years been known as a professional beggar, but his life appeared to have been a very quiet and innocent one. There the matter stands at present, and the questions which have to be solved. What Neville Sinclair was doing in the opium den, what happened to him, where he is now, and what Hugh Boone had to do with this disappearance. Us all are far from solution as ever. I confess that I cannot recall any case within my experience which looked at the first glance so simple, and yet presented such difficulties. While Sherlock Holmes had been detailing these singular series of events, we had been whirling through the outskirts of the great town until the last straggling of houses had been left behind, and we rattled along a country hedge upon either side of us. Just as he finished, however, we drove through 2 scattered villages where a few lights still glimmered in the windows. "We are on the outskirts of Leeds," said my companion. "We have touched on 3 English counties in our short drive, starting in Middlesex, passing over an angle of Surrey, and ending in Kent. See that light among the trees? That is the Cedars, and beside that lamp sits a woman whose anxious ears have already, I have little doubt, caught the clink of our horses' feet." "But why are you not conducting the case from Baker Street?" I asked. "Because there are many inquiries which must be made out here. Mrs. Sinclair has kindly put 2 rooms at my disposal, and you may rest assured that she will have nothing but a welcome from my friend and colleague. I hate to meet her, Watson, when I have no news of her husband. There we are." "Whoa there, whoa!" We had pulled up in front of a large villa which stood within its own grounds. A stable boy had run out to the horse's head, and springing him down, I followed Holmes up the small, winding gravel drive which led to the house. As we approached, the door flew open, and a little blonde woman stood in the opening, clad in some sort of light mousseline de soie, with a touch of fluffy pink chiffon at her neck and wrists. She stood with her figure outlined against the flood of light, one hand upon the door, one half raised in her eagerness, and her body slightly bent, her head and face protruded, with eager eyes and parted lips, and a standing question. "Well?" she cried. "Well?" And then, seeing that there were 2 of us, she gave a cry of hope, which sank into a groan as she saw that my companion shook his head and shrugged his shoulders. "No good news?" "None." "No bad?" "No." "Thank God for that. But come in, you must be wary, for you have had a long day. This is my friend Dr. Watson. He has been of most vital use to me in several of my cases, and a lucky chance has made it possible for me to bring him out here and associate him with this investigation." "I am delighted to see you," said she, pressing my hand warmly. "You will, I am sure, forgive anything that may be wanting in our arrangements when you consider the blow which has come so suddenly upon us." "My dear madam," said I am an old campaigner, and if I were not, I can very well see that no apology is needed. If I can be of assistance, either to you or to my friend here, I shall indeed be happy." "Now, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said the lady as we entered a well-lit dining-room, upon the table of which was a cold supper that had been laid out, "I should very much like to ask you 1 or 2 plain questions, to which I beg that you will give a plain answer." "Certainly, madam." "Do not trouble my feelings. I am not hysterical nor given to fainting. I simply wish to hear your real opinion." "Upon what point?" "In your heart of hearts, do you think that Neville is alive?" Sherlock Holmes seemed to be embarrassed by the question. "Frankly now," she repeated, standing upon the rug and looking keenly down at him as he leaned back in a basket chair. "Frankly, then, madam?" "I do not." "You think that he is dead?" "I do." "Murdered?" "I don't say that." Perhaps. And on what day did he meet his death? On Monday.